Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I know it's last day, but yeah, let's start with some brief introductions. Maybe starting with Shayne over there.
Sure. My name is Shayne Kennedy. I'm a corporate partner at the law firm of Latham and Watkins. I'm also the global chair of our healthcare and life sciences industry group. So my practice focuses on companies that cross every stage of the life cycle, but with a particular focus on IPOs and thereafter.
All right, I'm Eric Dimise with New York Stock Exchange on the Healthcare and Life Sciences Capital Markets team. In my capacity at the NYSE, I work with private companies on the road to going public. So that could mean a few months from now, it could mean a few years from now. So it's always good, and I think a theme today will be talk to us early to prep. In my capacity there, I work with companies looking to achieve a public transformation and support them on that journey.
Great, I'm Jaione Maiz, based in San Francisco. Work with a firm called Anzu Partners. We are an early stage deep tech investment firm. My focus is deep tech into life sciences, so that covers med device, med tech, diagnostics, cell and gene therapy, et cetera. My interaction with IPOs has been supporting our current companies as they think about different optionality for their exits, and then also in a previous context at SVB at Silicon Valley Bank doing 409A valuations and tracking those companies all the way from formation through IPO. So before that was a scientist, a PhD in neuroscience. So great to be here.
Great. I guess my first question is really, Shayne, you're obviously working with a number of companies that are, doing an IPO, and similarly, Eric, I guess, what are you both kind of seeing in terms of the pipeline right now? From where, because we also work with biotech companies, pharma, and like across the spectrum. Obviously, biotech is, gearing back up right now, but med device, I guess, not so much. Maybe can you talk a bit about why that is?
Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I'll give you sort of my impressions of it. Look, we're coming out of what was, just a terrible IPO market. I think IPOs as a whole sort of dropped like 93% or something like that in 2022. In 2023, we started to see a little bit of a rebirth, mostly towards the end of the year. There was a lot of good transactions announced sort of in Q4 of last year and rolling into this year. I think we saw some things coming out of JP Morgan, which was exciting. But in terms of med tech IPOs, and I always think of, at least in my experience, when the IPO market starts to come back, it's oftentimes led by the biotech companies because for them it is just like another financing and line of financings, and they always need money like crazy. And they don't need necessarily the same company profile that a med tech company needs to go public. So I think you see those start to come out. What I have been encouraged with is we're active right now, at least I couldn't speak to the whole firm, but on the West Coast, we're active right now on 3 or 4 med tech IPOs. So will they go out this year? I think that's going to be an interesting question to see, but the fact that these folks have ramped up, engaged banks, started a process, and are starting to work with the SEC is encouraging. From my perspective, I think what we're hearing when we talk to banks is, you've got sort of a window between now and call it August, September. And then I think they expect to see things sort of slow down as a result of the election and sort of people not knowing exactly how that's going to impact the market. And so if you're not out by, call it September, you're probably a Q1 or Q2 2025 IPO company. It's kind of what I'm hearing.
So I think I'm going to have to agree with just about all of that. I think we're going to agree on a lot of things today. 2023 was obviously a super quiet year for a lot of obvious reasons, most of them being macro in nature, I think. So biotech is a leading indicator. I would agree with that. We've already seen that this year between January and February, 6 biotech IPOs compared to last year's 12. So we're already 50% of the way of achieving what we did in biotech through an entire year in 2023. I think with the macro environment looking better, and we can obviously look at most of the first quarter, and even today with all the major indices closing up, we had a very robust IPO today. and looking at the biotech market, I think we're feeling generally optimistic at NYSE about the course of the year writ large. I think for medtech in particular, I would agree. I think there is a pipeline of medtech companies that want to go public, and I think the time frame that you flagged also resonates. The question now for those companies is, let's monitor the market. Fortunately, they're in a situation, I think most of them, we don't feel like we need to rush. We don't want to rush the market. We'll get the process started, and then we'll see how end of year looks or early next year looks. And so when I'm talking about sort of recovery from a very, very slow year in 2023, when history is written, I think it'll be how did 2024 perform, and then sort of first half of 25 to really understand the rebound from the lows we hit last year. And so I think I agree with everything you said. The pipeline seems about right. And I think that's a reason to be optimistic, taking in, the broader market into account. I think we'll probably get into this in terms of the election, but I think the coverage in the media around the election may overblow a little bit maybe a little bit overblown, in my opinion. I think there'll be a window around the election itself where there'll be a slowdown of issuance, but it's not going to be an enormous window, in our opinion. I think you're right that summer will quiet down as it tends to do, and I don't think that's a strange thing. But potentially looking at a window of opportunity in 2024 at the end of the year, once we sort of get past the election Thanksgiving sort of time frame.
Yeah, and I think a little bit of what pushes medtech companies in particular, like into 2025, right, is that oftentimes those IPOs are getting priced based on a multiple of revenue, right? And so now, the closer you get to 2025, it starts to make sense to wait, right, and see what the revenue was for 2024 and price off of that, as opposed to your 2023 revenue or 2022 revenue. So there's like a bunch of stuff that you're thinking about when you're thinking about what that pricing is. But I think for medtech companies in particular, where oftentimes they're pricing off of that, you will see them start to slip into the next year to take advantage of another good year, if that's what they're saying.
Great, thanks. And Jaione, I guess, can you talk a bit about what your advice was for some of the portfolio companies maybe last year that were looking, to raise funding, but the IPO market was closed? Like, what forms of alternative financing? And I guess even for some of the audience members out here, like, what advice would you have, for companies, currently in this in-between, kind of maybe doing a crossover funding round?
Yeah, it's obviously been very difficult to fundraise over the past 12, 18 months. We have been pushing hard to look for alternative, maybe there's government funding, right? Different organizations that are interested in supporting projects or companies. And then specifically partnerships, right? Partnerships with strategics. If you can get some non-dilutive financing, that's also validation for the company to help move that next validation or milestone. We've seen those be really impactful for our companies.
And I'm going to ask this question, like, how early is too early, for a med tech company, as they're starting to prepare? I think what is interesting, for biotech companies, obviously they're doing IPOs. We were seeing when the market was super hot, like preclinical company. Still, we also still had a preclinical biotech go out, earlier this year. Obviously, performance-wise, didn't really do that great. But for med device, I'm always seeing that, it's always, after the approval, and it's, from a valuation standpoint. Do you see that changing? Or because now there are certain companies that are kind of, I would say, like this in-between kind of device, kind of drug approach. Like, what would be your counsel and kind of advice to those companies, and how far in advance should they be thinking about, getting the right advisors and meeting with the exchanges? I know that's a loaded question.
That's a multi-part question.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to unpack there. But I do agree with you. So I would say historically, med tech company thinking about going public, the things that we would be talking to them about are from a preparedness standpoint to do an IPO, because there's so much focus on operations and revenue, right, is really like your ability to predict going forward, what those numbers are going to be, right? Because that's what you're going to be measured against as a public company. So I think there's a couple things to think about. One is milestones, like what are the milestones coming up that are going to be value generating, and how do you think about the timing of an IPO relative to those milestones? So if you were a med tech company trying to go public before you had approval, those milestones would be very important, right? Like, when do we think we're going to finish the clinical trial that we're going to use to file for our PMA or our 510K? How does that fit into the framework? When do we think we'll get the feedback on that? How does that fit into the timing of the IPO? Because what you're going to see is investors, like, they want surety. So the only thing they have to look at in that context is, what are the results of this clinical trial, or when are they coming? And what is the likelihood of approval? And so you would want to think about the timing relative to those things. On the finance side, like, as a medtech company, you 100% need to be able to, like, forecast that 2025 is going to be X, and then you have to hit that, right? And so starting to think about how good you are at being able to do those things are critical to sort of being able to be a public company, which is an important part of this decision process, right? It's not just, can we go public? It's, can we be a public company? And there's a lot that's wrapped up in that. So I think those types of things are things you can start thinking about right away, right? Like, even if you're a year, 18 months out, those are the types of things you can start to think about in terms of, like, when do we really want to engage on this process? How do we want to fit it in? And there's a lot of stuff you can be doing in the interim period, right? Like starting to build relationships with investment banks, starting to connect with analysts, and starting to tell your story and get that, like, out there. You don't want those first conversations to be, the month before you did your org meeting, or heaven forbid, like during TTW type things the first time. So I think those are all things you can get started on right away. And then, like, just from a pure legal perspective, like, if you are going to go public, like, get your team together like 6 months at least before the day you're going to kick that process off, and start to go through what you need to do. I don't want to talk more. There's more to say, but
No, I mean, I would agree with that. I certainly get concerned if we're talking to a company where we say, well, it's too soon to be talking to an exchange or thinking about this. And you say, well, what is your rough timeline? And they say, oh, we're at least 12 months out. I say, well, you should absolutely be talking to us now. And who else have you spoken with? And what relationships do you have? And start today. start today. So I think the key takeaway is, without being repetitive, to start early and prep. You don't want, to your point, your first earnings call to be the first time you've ever gone through that process. So we often, advise companies, before you IPO, do a couple quarterly earnings calls as a private company, so that you're prepared to do that. We see companies go out and do that for the first time, and someone says one thing that doesn't sound good to investors, and the stock can be dramatically impacted, and no one wants that. So I would agree with all of that in terms of prepare, get your partners in line, including your bankers and analysts. One thing we often say is, you date your banker, but you marry your analyst. These are the folks who are going to be, publishing research and providing buy, sell, hold advice to the buy side. And so understanding who those folks are, building those relationships by going to the sell side conferences and presenting and getting to know them early can only help you. I think in terms of initially talking to the exchange, to get back to sort of my first conversation, I routinely talk to companies that are easily 2 years out from a transaction. And you should think about how an exchange can help you as a private company, because there's a lot we can do to help private companies along that journey. That's a big part of what I do every day, in addition to building the partnerships to execute a successful S1 and to get your valuation and to work with your bankers. Your exchanges can help with marketing and visibility. We can help with networking. We can help with events. All these things that bring you together with other members of the community that you're going to need to have relationships with to execute a successful IPO. So certainly, if I email you and you're 12 months out and you say, I'll get back to you when the time is right, and you're thinking 6 months, we can have a 30-minute conversation so you understand what an exchange can do to help support you on that journey. So that's another big piece of the puzzle. So I would sort of, on top of everything you said, I think the question was, when should we start conversations with us individually? I don't think there's any harm in having an early conversation, even 2 and 3 years out, even if we talk for 30 minutes and say, great, we'll connect at next year's JP Morgan. Talk to you in 12 months. That's okay, because you've had the conversation and understand how we can be helpful.
Can I add one more thing? The framework we use for our companies is 6 months of earnings. 6 quarters of earnings, right? So can you predict out what you're going to say in those 6 months? Is there predictable revenue? Is there predictable kind of milestones that we can address kind of in that time frame? And then going backward, we typically engage with companies first. That's like Series A. So then it's thinking about how do we maintain that optionality, right? IPO maybe, depending on micro and macro, but maybe it's M&A, and how do we think about all of that at the same time? So maybe that includes doing a fancy audit that prepares you for an IPO in case that, like a PCAOB or something, or maybe that's when is the right time to have that in place? When is the right time to think about a proper CFO? Do we want that CFO to have public company experience or not? And thinking about some of those frameworks just to kind of maintain that optionality in the early stages as we're growing the company.
And I guess if there's a company, I guess, that where the management team is, I guess, a bit green and they haven't really done an IPO, or maybe, let me rephrase, haven't done a successful IPO, I guess, should they be thinking about just bringing on independent board members? And I think, we discussed this a bit kind of in our prep call, I guess, in terms of, what should companies be looking for in board members, and how important is that board dynamic heading into an IPO? Like, should they be thinking about maybe using these board seats to fill in certain gaps that the management team doesn't have? I see Shayne nodding, so maybe go to him.
I think building the right board for your public company is like absolutely critical. I think folks have a tendency sometimes to think, we've got enough people on the board. Maybe we have to add one to fill this bucket. We'll take care of that at the time. One of the things you have to remember is that as a public company, getting somebody off of your board is like nearly impossible unless they're willing to leave. And so really taking the time to make sure that you have folks on your board that are providing the right experience and background, but also the right cultural fit is just absolutely critical. And that second piece of that is the piece that takes time, right? You've got to interview people. You've got to talk to them. You've got to have them meet with the rest of the board members to really identify the folks that you think are going to gel and be good. So thinking about that, 6 months or even more ahead of time, I think is important. The challenge you run into, right, is as a private company, if you've got, VC investors in there, then you've got all kinds of limitations in the documents in terms of who has to be on the board, how long they have to be on the board, who's going to vote, and all that type of stuff. Now, a lot of that goes away at the time of the IPO, and it gives you a little bit of flexibility. But thinking about that early and starting to plan it out, and also going to your existing board members and getting an understanding of who wants to stay on the board post-IPO and who wants to transition off is also helpful. So you really need a picture of what you're going to need and then how to build it, because some of the VCs will want to stay and some will be anxious to get out. And then you've got to think about things like diversity, and you've got to think about things like how do we build an audit committee that's got the right characteristics on it. So it's a complex process that takes some time.
I mean, I would add to that, I don't think we have to limit the discussion strictly to board composition, although everything you just said is spot on. I think, in our experience, you're working with companies that are going through this process and starting more than 6 months out, a year out, where maybe you need to hire a CFO, or maybe you need to change your CFO, or you need to add more more staffing beneath, to support the CFO to get through this process. And so certainly those are all considerations that need to be, thought through carefully. And are you bringing on a CFO that has done an IPO before? Are you going to, maintain the CFO you have, and how are we going to help train this person to achieve a successful IPO, given the complexities of the process? And so these are questions that we see companies grapple with across sectors, really all of the time, in terms of completing this journey, and it does take time.
Yeah, I would echo that, because I think you can get some value out of your board members in terms of their public company experience, but in terms of like going through an IPO process, that's not the place I would look for the support, right? I think, to your point, like you need a CFO that's been through the process, or maybe a GC that's been through the process, somebody that's going to be able to sort of take the reins for the most part of that transaction and really direct it, that's been through it before. And that's important too, because in many cases, you don't want that to be the CEO. Like, we want him involved, but we don't want that person spending all of their time on an IPO. They need to run the business, right? So having somebody that's been through that process and can really direct the process is critical to it being successful.
And I mean, what would be your advice to companies in the audience that are in the the banking syndication selection process? Like, how important, I'm not mentioning any names here, but I've honestly, not mentioning any names, but it could, kind of selecting the wrong kind of fit could really just blow up what could have been a really great IPO. And I think, to your point, even on the CFO, like, this was like years ago now, but I remember I was working with this oncology company and they were like spectacular. Everything was great until they hired literally that CFO that unfortunately just blew the company apart and just blew the entire IPO process apart. And the company never recovered, unfortunately, because it's oncology. Their competition moved on, and it was just down round after down round. And it was just heartbreaking to kind of see that. But, kind of going through the trenches, all three of you, like, what would be your advice in terms of just situations you've seen where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that blew up IPO? I guess rephrase a different way. What should companies avoid and not do?
Yeah, I feel like I'm talking too much, so you guys jump in.
Do you have a take from sort of the earlier side in terms of?
Well, to answer the first question, I think about bankers, right? Going back to the analysts, so important, right?
Yeah.
So meeting those folks early, understanding how they do their work, what they're looking for, seeing who might make sense for you, super important. And I would say early is fine, right? Yeah, but I'll pass off part two.
In terms of selecting bankers, if you're approaching the point of, or looking like you're going to approach an IPO, you're probably going to be, the banks will be reaching out to you, I think, in this environment. I think it really flipped from the height of the 21, 22 boom that we learned a lot from, where now I think you will be the subject of outreach from the banks, and then you'll have to think about who you want to work with and understand their track record and what they're really strong at. Now, if it's a bulge bracket bank, then they probably have deep experience in your sector, and then maybe it comes down to the cost of working with that bulge bracket bank. So it'll I think I don't know exactly what else to add in terms of selecting a bank versus them coming after, reaching out to you and thinking about what's best for your business. I don't know.
I'll add one more little thing onto that, which is you can ask them for comps, right? Like, especially some of these newer, somebody said on an earlier panel, but companies are more and more across categories, right? It may not just be this category or this bucket. And so asking them like, hey, what would you pin us against? Like, what do you think are good transactions, or what are good IPOs, or what are, how would you think about our business, right? Is a helpful way to kind of gauge, do they get it? Like, do they get what you're doing or not?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. A lot of times if I'm talking to companies that are thinking about their bank syndicate, I sort of tell them, look, if you have the good fortune of having bulge bracket banks interested in you, then 100% you should have one or two of the bulge bracket banks on the top line of your IPO leading the deal. And I say that because I think that's a definite sign to the market that, like, this is a legitimate company that folks really believe in. So I think that gives your IPO, like, right off the bat, a little bit of additional legitimacy. And look, those bulge bracket banks get deals done. I mean, they just do, right? So I think that gives you the highest likelihood of a successful IPO. Then I think when you start to think about, sort of the co-managers and the other underwriters that make up that syndicate, we've touched on this, that is, in my perspective, when you're really looking at who are the folks that have the analysts in the space that we want covering us, that we need covering us. And that's one of the ways that you pick up sort of the analyst coverage that you need is through co-managers that you might have on your bank. And a lot of times, those banks are the ones that might have even more particular experience within your industry, so they can help guide you from that perspective. The other thing I say is, all bulge brackets are not the same, and we all like people differently than others. And so it's absolutely critical to meet with these folks, talk to them, understand who exactly from the bank is going to be working on your transaction, who's the person you're going to be working with day to day, and how do you fit with them. Again, what's the culture? Do they have the right sense? Do they get the story that as you think it is and are willing to help you tell it in a way that, is compelling for you from your perspective? They're not all the same that way. And, you may gravitate towards one or the other, and I think that's appropriate and you should follow that.
And I guess I wanted to save some time for audience Q&A at the end, but other question is really, what are the, I guess, macroeconomic factors? Just, I think we mentioned obviously the election. I think in biotech, obviously the IRA, but for medtech, what are some other factors that you think could really impact, how hot the medtech IPO market is this year?
I think one of the things you'll see help the market, which I think we're starting to see, is just strategics re-engaging, right? I think that when we start to see them engaging and looking for acquisitions, then that tends to boost the IPO market, right? Because that's a sign that that there's some value here that folks should be extracting. And you may end up selling to the strategic, but the fact that there are strategics in, and I think we are starting to see them, reemerge in the space, I think is a factor that helps drive that market.
I would say that's definitely a sort of a leading indicator. And it's certainly something that we're seeing happen in biotech now, again, potentially with a record-breaking M&A record for Q1. I think you asked macro, and so I think obviously with the expectation that there will be cuts in interest rates is a huge plus over last year. In conversation, we usually say it's you're in a much better position. You're talking about when interest rates will go down and when they will stop going up. And so the story that we told last year is that they kept going up, and then we saw the market respond in late December when the announcement was that we will stop increasing them in the S&P, the Dow, NASDAQ, all shot up at the end of the year. That's when the XBI in biotech started to rebound, and that's traced its way through the first quarter of this year. And so I think that is a huge piece. There's just so many macro headwinds that we were facing through 2023 are different this year, or sort of priced in. The market sort of figured them out. I think just to go back to the election, because that's obviously a big piece of what I get asked all the time. I don't know if you get asked, but I get asked this all the time about the impact of the election. So I think an interesting stat to think about in terms of overall market performance in an election year is that 20 of the last 24 election cycles, the S&P has closed up on the year. Okay, two of the years when S&P closed down were 1932 and 1940. Okay, the other years were 2000 and 2008. So in terms of overall market performance versus an election, that's sort of one question to think about. They may not necessarily be coupled in the way that I think broader coverage is getting. And then I already talked about sort of the expectations around new issuance around the election. And I think, on our capital markets team, we're a little more bullish in terms of the windows being a little more open than sort of press coverage may suggest they will be, in terms of the windows being closed somehow permanently for the later half of the year. But getting to the macro, I get asked this all the time, so I wanted to make sure we sort of check that box, and feel free to revisit in Q&A.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit more, and it's perhaps less macro than your macro, but trending is, from our perspective, it's hard to look at the public comps and that are all under, trading under cash, right? and think that that's an aspirational kind of path for a company, and that's made it really difficult. So hopefully these other things that Shayne and Eric are talking about will help lift companies up, the ones that are already public, right? To, in addition to the good performance at the company, help support that rising tide. I think will be beneficial, hopefully for others.
And should companies always be looking at a dual track strategy? Or are there certain types of companies, or does that just happen naturally? It's like pretty much in biotech, it's like I feel like every single biotech is like running some type of dual track process.
I feel that way.
Right. And so yeah.
I think I don't think that's unusual. I would say it's the norm right now.
Right.
I think it almost feels unwise to not entertain both options, or at least to potentially prep for that. I'd be interested in terms of how you talk to a company.
No, I think 100%. I mean, I think it's just assumed, and I think the
Yeah.
question is like, how aggressively are you going to pursue the dual track,
Yeah.
right? So, you may have your bankers reach out to a few folks that you think are likely, acquirers, or you may like try to run a full process, right, where you really aggressively go out. I think the former is probably more common and usually happens all the time. You might even get inbound requests, right? Like as soon as, the interesting thing about all the confidential filings now is that it doesn't have the same impact as it used to, because you publicly flip and you've only got 2 weeks before you're doing a roadshow, whereas before, you filed that thing and it was 4 months until you were public. So everybody got to see what was going on, and you got a lot more inbound, I think, requests during that process. So now I think it takes a little bit of activity on the side of the bankers to see what's out there. But I would say everybody that we work with pursues it at some level.
I'll add, Eric and I talked a little bit about this earlier, but single asset companies are a little bit tougher, right? If it's a single molecule in biopharma or a single thing in some med tech, right? It's still possible, but I think that makes it a little bit harder.
Any, I guess, lightning round final thoughts for the audience before we heading to Q&A?
The one other trend that I'm hearing right now that is different from what I've heard historically about medtech companies, which I think is interesting, is I think historically you might have thought of a medtech IPO candidate as someone that's an approved product and probably, let's call it $50 million in revenue, right, with a run rate that looks exciting. I will say that we have been engaged with a few folks now that are earlier stage, right? And I think you might have mentioned this, Kim, but some of these companies are really sort of like almost trying to fit themselves into the biotech type of company, right? Like, we're first in class, we've got great data, we've got a huge market. So like if we get approved, there's this huge ramp, and that's a very interesting. That's a different dynamic from what we're accustomed to. It's one that drives evaluation, I think, much higher than folks that are thinking of, okay, we're a $300 million company post-IPO because we got X revenue type thing. And so I think you see folks interested in that because it provides potential higher valuations, but also allows you to get out earlier. And they're also thinking of it like a biotech company where it's just the next financing, right, to get to the next milestone. So that, I think, is actually pretty interesting because it is a very different dynamic than what we've seen historically. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Would you say that depends primarily on novelty of what they're offering?
Yeah.
Highly differentiated,
Yeah.
truly different, so that you can position yourself that way?
Yeah, I think you're first in class effectively,
Yes.
right? No one's doing anything like what you're doing.
Yeah.
No one's seen it before. Like that type of technology, I think, has a chance to fit into that.
Yeah. So lightning round, I guess, prepare, and prepare early, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a key takeaway, and something a conversation I try to have with every company that we speak with that are early in the process, and make sure that we're all defining early the same way.
Yeah, I was going to say early too. Just like folks say, hey, think about your regulatory strategy and reimbursement early. Talk to the FDA earlier than you think you might need to. Like, engage with these folks earlier than you think you might need to. Like, start seeing who around the table, your board, your company, whoever, your lawyers, who has experience, who doesn't, like what are some of the things that they're thinking about, even if it's years out, just education.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. So we've got 5 minutes for a Q&A. If the audience has any questions, feel free. I think there's a microphone there.
Hi, thank you so much. Amazing, enlightening. My name is Anmol Kapoor. I'm a cardiologist from Canada. I am into multi-omics, AI, and blockchain, and we are seeing some transition happening in healthcare. So what are you guys seeing from an IPO perspective, the companies into data analysis, big data analysis in multi-omics? Is that catching up, or are you guys hearing things about here?
You're the stock market.
It's all about data, because, for example, 1 GB, so one DNA is 100 GB, right? So, but as precision health is getting more popular, more accessible, and more affordable, the technology companies working in this sphere probably will be going to profit from it. But what are you guys seeing in your side?
I mean, I think in the pipeline, for certain, that type of approach exists right now. In terms of actual issuance currently, I think it's still something where we have to see how it plays out, and that may take a few years of companies going public to sort of figure out how that performs. I think a challenging piece right now is that it seems like across the board, companies are using AI or ML or sort of big data in their branding. And so I think a big piece in terms of the investors that are buying IPOs right now is to understand what that means in the context of each company. I think that's challenging. So I think it's still somewhat early days in terms of analyzing IPO and post-market performance for the specific thing you're talking about, but I think it'll probably play out over the next few years. I mean, in terms of the pipeline, would you?
I mean, I think I agree. I agree with all that. I think like digital health right now, right, is like a huge catchphrase. Everybody wants to do it. Everybody, and if you ask somebody what that is, you'll get 10 different definitions, right? Nobody really knows what it is. So it's definitely something that folks want to focus on. They think it's important. And I think the trick with something like big data, right, is going to be like, how do you explain the value proposition of that, the money that is going to be generated from that, right? Like everybody's talking about they have it or they're going to generate it, right? But then how do you convert that into cash? And so I think that's going to be the piece that once people get their arms around how that works and see it come to fruition, then I think that will help the market. But there's like a hunger and thirst for anything that is digital health right now. So there definitely is momentum out there to find those things and see what can be done with them.
Hey, just to add, we look a lot at multi-omic things, right? And one question is, does it become a diagnostic? Is it a tool to come up with new omics, right? Like what part of the ecosystem are you kind of playing with? What does your final asset look like? And then if you're adding blockchain, like you're probably gonna have to do some work to help educate on how these different components might interact and maybe framed up toward the final impact, right, of your ecosystem, of your own ecosystem.
No, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining me on this panel. And thanks, LSI. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, kid.